Hello, in this video I'm showing you the game between Fabiano Caruana and Daniel Naroditsky from round 5 of US Championship. They played the Ruy Lopez, after which Naroditsky chose a rare line, d6. The idea behind this is to keep things solid, to fianchetto his bishop on g7, and to wait for white to strike in the center with d4, after which his bishop on g7 might become active in the future. And this is what happened. White played d4 like it usually happens in the Ruy Lopez. Black doesn't do anything about it, because once he takes on d4, the center is usually white's, and he might face some problems in the center, so he waits for the right moment to take on d4. So far he just waits with the capture on d4. For now, he takes on d4 now, and he castles. And now the most important thing is that white doesn't have e5 break, because in this case black can answer with knight d5 and get his knight maybe to b6 if necessary, and this is not really critical for black in this moment. For example, if the bishop was on b3 in this case, imagine that bishop is on b3, then knight would have to go back to more passive square, which is e8 potentially, and black would be more cramped than he would be on d5. Also here, if white played h3 here, so if he waits with something like a3, then black can activate his bishop. He can open up his bishop, and now white faces a tough choice. Does he want to play d5? If he plays d5 here, black can exchange some pieces with knight e5, and after bishop takes e5, all his pieces seem to work really harmoniously, and this position is fine for black. In case he goes to f1, then there's this pin, which is quite unpleasant because of the pressure on d4 pawn, and basically white would be forced to capture on c6, which would give up the bishop pair, and even though this pawn structure is kind of ruined, it's still unpleasant to face this pressure on d4, and bishop on g7 might become a monster once the pressure on d4 becomes unbearable. So to avoid this pin, he plays h3, and here, which usually happens in cases with less space, when one side has less space, then that side tends to exchange pieces. White took, black took, and now black also has a small threat, which is knight d3, to exchange a knight for this bishop, which might become dangerous in the future, and once white gets his bishop out, he can oppose this bishop. So it's important to, if black can take out this bishop, so the bishop on g7 doesn't have an opposition. White plays queen b3 to stop knight d3, and also tries to push away this knight, which is a bit annoying at this moment. Black defends it by playing a5, and now finally he pushes this knight away with a3, and now he goes back to c6. Of course, just to mention, this pawn on b7 is not for free, because after queen takes b7, black has rook fb8, and now queen is trapped. White would have to give up his queen. Instead, he plays knight f1, trying to open up his dark square bishop, and also to put his knight to a more promising square, like g3 maybe, or something else. Black plays a4. His idea now is to improve his knight from c6 and to get it from a5 to b3. White plays queen d3, gets away, and now, like I said, black is trying to realize his plan with putting his knight on b3, and that started with a4. Bishop g5, trying to activate his last piece, and now knight b3 comes. Rook d1, protecting this d4 pawn one more time, and now, because bishop on g5 is a bit active here, so h6 wants to eliminate it or push it to a less active square, and now white took on f6. He took back, and now this knight on b3 has to be exchanged or just kicked away, because it's really like a thorn in white's position. And here black goes back, and here just white wants to improve his knight, get it to c3, and trying to control central squares. An interesting option here was to push e5, and you might think that this is a blunder, because if you take on e5, you cannot take back with the pawn because queen is hanging, but white has this intermezzo, knight e4, and after bishop gets away, now you can take on e5 with the pawn, but you can also take with the knight, and after, let's say, some logical move like queen d5 to block this pawn, now white has queen f3, trying to go knight f6 at some point. In this case, knight f6 would win a queen, and let's imagine that black gets away from this check. White can get to f4, defending the knight on e5, and after rook a8, knight c3 would be very unpleasant for black. That's just to show how it's not the forced line or the best line for both sides, but it's just to show some possibilities for white. Instead, Fabiano played knight b1 here, and black plays b5. He tries now maybe to get c4 as an outpost for his knight. He goes queen c2, bishop g7 back, not to allow e5 with tempo, knight c3, c6, and now he pushes his e-pawn. And now if black plays d5 here, there's a huge hole on c5, and white might try to play rook e2, replace his knight from f3 to d3 and c5 next. And also there's a additional possibility of going d6, e6, sorry. And the idea is, if you take, queen takes g6, and now e5 is also quite weakened, e6 pawn is weak also. So it would not be so easy for black to counter that. Black just waits with rook f8, and now white activates his knight to the center, knight c4. That's the point, the whole point of b5 played. And now I think that white cannot hold this tension in the center anymore, so he takes on d6, because e5 is under attack a lot of times. E d6, knight d6, and now we have a d4 pawn which is isolated, but white goes knight e5, and after queen f5, this is a nice trick, because if knight d6, queen takes queen. That's why Caruana plays g4, and now the only move that can be played is queen e6, because you need to defend your knight on d6. And here Fabiano made a mistake, not a huge mistake, but it gave away a lot of advantage. He went back to c3. Here it was better just to capture on d6, and after queen d6, knight c6. Take the pawn on c6, and now, if he takes, you cannot go to c8 to pin this knight, because knight e7 would just win the game on the spot, losing the rook on the next move. But instead of that, bishop d4 is possible. And now white cannot pin black because he has queen g3. And now he's taking the h3 pawn with check, and he brings back his bishop to g7, and he's just a pawn up. So after bishop d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. This position is slightly better for white, but I think that Fabiano wanted to make things more complicated, more tactical. This would be a technical position which might not end up with a win for white. So he wanted to make things a bit complex. He went knight c3, and black just defends his c pawn and also prepares potentially c5. And also, black's idea is to play c5 because he wants to dislodge this knight from e5. This knight on e5 is currently very, very annoying and cramping this bishop. So white tries to double his rooks, and also threatening to take on c6 next move, because in this case he would just give up 2 rooks and a knight for a queen, which is too much material to give up. He plays rook e2, wanting to go knight c6, and here black goes queen b3. He wants to exchange queens, after which he would put pressure on this knight on e5 by pushing c5. Because the only thing that holds this knight is this pawn, so you want to somehow deflect this pawn by pushing c5. White took ab, and now white played king g2. And like I said, he wants to go and ruin this pawn center, which is only the d4 pawn. And after dc5, knight c4, because the knight is under attack and you need to move it first. So this is a temporary pawn sacrifice, but as you can see, this b3 pawn is really close to the promotion square, so it's not very pleasant for white. White took. If he went knight d3 in this position, black would take on c3, and now after captures bc, black would pin this knight, and the position would be really bad for white, because a3 pawn is also hanging. The b3 pawn is really dangerous, so it's not easy for white. So he took on c4, rook takes rook, and now Fabiano makes a decisive mistake, which is knight captures. Here, apparently, it was better to play knight b6. And after bishop c3, knight c8, bishop takes on b2, now rook d3, and after bishop takes on a3, it takes that dangerous pawn, but still white's losing a pawn on f2, because you have to capture the b pawn. And in this position, black is comfortably better. He has a clean pawn up. He's a clean pawn up, and he would try to squeeze this advantage to the whole point. Instead, he went for knight e2, which seemed logical to be honest. After bc4, he went rook c1. If he tried to defend his pawn, let's say, with this move, then black would just capture on c5, and after king f3, black would activate his rook to d2, and b2 pawn is very, very shaky. And now if you try knight c3 to block this bishop, then you would just capture, and play rook d3, capture a pawn on c3, and with these two pawns on b3 and c4, it's going to be a very convincing win for black. So instead he wants to capture a pawn on c4 and maybe to attack somehow this b pawn. Black took on b2, white took on c4, and after bishop a3, now the c5 pawn is under attack. So he pushes it, black pushes his, and white wants to stop the promotion of the b pawn. And now this very nice move allows black to just defend his b2 pawn from g7, which is a very safe square for his bishop. On a3 he would not be that safe because it doesn't have a good scope. It just hits the b2 pawn and doesn't do anything. From g7 it's safe, and when I say safe, it's not possible to attack it so easily. When it's on a3, rook can attack it from a4, and it's not easy to hold this pawn. By bishop f8, he gets to g7 and takes over the control. Knight b1, bishop g7, and now the second part of this plan is to activate his king, get it to d6, and capture this pawn, which is the only source of counterplay for white. And once the c6 pawn is gone, then the rook can activate and put pressure on this knight on b1. King f3 also activating, and now white tries h4. He's trying to decimate the pawns on the king side, so imagine that there are no pawns on the king side. This position would be probably a draw, because even if you give up a knight for this b pawn, it's still a draw, because rook and bishop versus rook is a theoretical draw. So black has to keep at least one pawn on this side, on the king side, and that would guarantee a win. He goes h4, trying to push h5 and exchange some pawns on this side. King gets closer to the c pawn. And now the pawn is taken. Rook c1 is a big threat now. So white has to generate some counterplay against this bishop, which defends b2. Bishop e5, knight d2, and now rook c2. King is defending it because if you go back to b1, he has rook c1, and after knight a3, if knight d2 happens, then I think that this is winning. Bishop c3, and if knight e4, king c6. And now you would like to have this, but I can even take with check and take the rook after. So he defends it by his king, king c6, and now rook b3. He's allowing the exchange of rooks. And now rook c3 takes. He goes back, and now bishop b4, nicely cutting this knight. Doesn't allow any squares for this knight. And also, in a few moves, h5 will come, creating a passed pawn, and now the king is not sure where to go. Does he want to go to the b pawn or to the h pawn? And that will decide the game. White plays f4, king d5, getting closer, and now he wants to go towards the a2 square, on which he would attack the knight. So white tries to stop it, but now the h-pawn runs. And now f5, and his idea is now if black takes, that he takes on h5, and he pushes the h-pawn, deflects the king from defending either b2 or f5. And but here he just takes on g4, and after fg, he chases this pawn. After king e4, he pushes g3 and defends it by bishop d6. And in this position, Fabiano Caruana resigned because his knight is stuck defending the b1 promotion square. King is stuck chasing this g-pawn. Black's king is going to take the g-pawn and just run towards the knight. And he will win this knight, after which the remaining endgame is a piece of cake. So that was this game, and apparently the biggest upset of the whole championship so far. And thank you for watching. If you like this video, share, subscribe, like. Have a good day. Bye.